Absolutely ecstatic, Senator Johnston, to have you here this evening. And we've got a regular mic too, if you want to use that one. I don't know.
Use this one. It works, yeah.
We're just going to get into the meat of it and get rolling. We'll get the presentations done. The DAC will do some Q&A, and it's a small group. Originally, I wasn't planning on taking audience questions because if these seats were all full, that could be very daunting and go late. But if there's time, we will get to some of that. So as you're listening to the presentation, jot some down, and we'll have some time. So thank you. So grab that one.
You bet. Can you all hear me okay? Is that loud enough? Great. Okay. I'll put it up a little bit more. Well, thank you so much. And I apologize to David multiple times, but apologize profusely to the folks who've been waiting in the crowd. The Senate President tells you never to schedule anything on the week of the long bill because you never know how long the day would go. I figured 6:30 at night would still be safe, but apparently not so safe. So I'm sorry about that. We just got out of caucus end of the night, and turns out coming down I-25 at 6 o'clock is not always the best time to make that time.
Is that why it's so long?
That's right, it's even longer. So thank you all so much for waiting, and again, so sorry for keeping you waiting. I think I'm most excited to get questions from you and have a conversation, so I'm not sure, David, what's most helpful. Do you want me to give a few-minute overview on the proposal? Great. So I know all of you probably have better things to do in your spare time than read 200-page pieces of legislation in the state capitol. So I'll give you maybe just a 5-minute overview of what is proposed in the legislation and what we're hoping to accomplish, and what the structure is essentially between what is proposed in legislation, what is proposed at the ballot, and how those two things work, and then be happy to take questions. So again, it's a 200-page bill, and so there's lots of details. I'll try to give you the 30,000-foot overview of what is it that we're trying to accomplish. And the backstory is started about 2 years ago, looking at the question of what would it take to try to build a world-class education system here in Colorado, and what would it take to ensure that we think every kid could be competitive in college and a career when they come out, whatever they might choose to do. And so brought a wide array of groups together, including business organizations, teachers group, principals group, superintendents group, higher ed, and some of the nonprofits around the state who work on education, and spent about a year working on what would it take to build that system. We didn't start with any preconceived notions of does it take more reform or does it take more revenue. There were people on the group who believed both and who believed neither. There were some folks who believed the problem is you got to reform the system a lot more and not give it any more money, and there are folks who thought you got to put a lot more money in the system and not change it at all. And so after about a year, we came out with a preliminary set of proposals, recommendations that came out of this, what we call the School Finance Partnership. And I've spent the last now year taking those pretty big policy ideas and trying to put them into concrete action or legislation. So over that time, I've had, this will be somewhere around about my 160th or so public meeting, and we've had about 2,500 stakeholders involved so far. I've met with leaders from around 150 of the 178 school districts around the state. So I've tried to get as comprehensive of an approach as possible, although there's always more yarn, more ball to the yarn when you pull. And so the basic proposal that came out with consensus recommendations from this group, and now we've spent a year working on, includes 3 big buckets of change. One is, what does it take to modernize our school funding formula? And there are some significant changes to be made. For those of you in the audience, the last time the school finance formula was written, no one in this room had either a cell phone, an email address, or access to the internet. That is a little bit about not to mention there was not yet a single charter school in the state. And so the landscape has changed dramatically. The formula just hasn't changed yet. Second one is, what will we try to do to make investments that we know will make a big difference? Where are the places we think will get the most significant return on investment around places to invest money? And then the third is, what do we do to make the school funding more transparent, more accountable, and more equitable? So let me walk you through those 3 big buckets as briefly as possible, so we can have a good time in the conversation and questions. So on the first bucket, what do we do to modernize the school funding formula? First step is, we currently have a system in Colorado where the way the School Finance Act works is essentially you take any student you have in a seat on October 1st, and we give you in Douglas County around $6,000 for that student. So essentially, every student in the state is worth $6,000 on October 1st and is worth $0 every other day of the school year. And so it's not a very rational way to fund student count days, because it means There's not an incentive to say take students in the middle of the year, although the schools do it anyway. There's not an incentive to try to fight kids from leaving or dropping out or transferring in the middle of the year. And so what we proposed is moving towards what's essentially a daily cap day, which means conceptually, instead of being worth $6,000 in one day of the year and nothing the other 183 days, a student is worth $30 all 200 days of the year. So if a student stays all year through that school, great. If the student stays half the year and decides they'd rather go to a charter school or an online school or a district high school in another district, then that funding would follow that student when they move. So first is a change to the count date. Second is an attempt to try to allow students, particularly high school students, to access content in the way that they learn best. So help students learn the way they learn best. And that means what we know is in the 21st century, not every kid is going to access every bit of content they get from the four walls of a brick and mortar school. In the same way that you and I don't anymore get all the news that we get from a printed newspaper. You get it online, you get it by Facebook, by Twitter, by email. And so what we're proposing is more flexibility around how students could use those dollars. And right now what happens is we essentially intensely audit the schedule of every high school student in the state. And if you were a student at Douglas High School and you had 7 periods in the day, and you only were enrolled for 6 of those periods because you're a high school senior who's met most of her credit requirements, the state would automatically dock you from a full-time student to a half-time student. So it would cut half of your funding if a student took even one course off if she didn't need it. So what we've said instead is we ought to give those dollars to districts, but also give those students more flexibility about how to use them. And so if that young girl who has a free period now on her schedule at Douglas High School wants to be able to, say, take an online course, or concurrently enroll, or go to community college, or go to CSU Global to take an online course, they would be able to use those dollars to access content inside the school or outside the school. So those are 2 major ones. The third one is we have a number of districts who would like to, and districts that want to. We want to be able to offer the opportunity to do extended school years or extended school days for those districts who feel like they want additional time to be able to either catch up or get ahead in terms of the race. It's an important piece of data that folks often think that the major challenge in America is the achievement gap. I would say the excellence gap is equally dramatic as a jumping off point. If you look at our highest performing students in the United States of America, so our top quartile of performers in the US, which is our very best, whatever background they come from, whatever school, whatever state. If you take those students and compare them against the top performers from countries around the world, America ranks around 28 just in our best against their best. And so the notion is not just that we have kids who are falling behind, it's kids that even are, those kids that are excelling might be excelling against their peers in their school district or in their state. We know we're significantly falling behind against kids in the rest of the country, and so we want to make sure that we're giving dollars to all kids to be able to do that. We're also, as part of that, we're proposing a more flexible innovation fund, which would allow school districts who are doing innovative things and want to pursue innovative practices to be able to apply for competitive funds to be able to do that. So that's part of making more of the funding competitively grant-based as opposed to just all purely formula allocated as it is currently. So that's what are we trying to do to modernize the formula? I apologize, I'm going fast because I want to leave most of the time for questions. So anything that's of interest to you, just flag for me. I'll come back to the things that aren't, you can not worry about. On the making investments that make a difference, we want to make some key investments in areas that we know have the highest return on investment. Those include, first of all, investing in full-day kindergarten in the state. We don't currently fund full-day kindergarten. This proposal will allow every student who wants to be able to take it to access full-day kindergarten. Would invest in early childhood education for 3- and 4-year-olds who are on the wait list for the Colorado preschool program, who have the highest chance of not being ready for kindergarten when they start and not being literate when they start the 4th grade, which we know are the 2 biggest indicators of ongoing academic problems, and by the way, are the 2 biggest drivers of costs in a system as you look at increased rates of special education identification and intervention services going in. So it's a significant savings for us to do that by investing early. That key investment also going to make a significant across-the-board investment in all districts to support their investment in what we're calling the Teacher and Leadership Initiative, which is the most important resource districts have are their people. And so we want to make sure that they can invest in teachers and leaders and the administrators they'll need to help ensure success and to help implement all of the big things we have going on in the state. So we are, in the next 4 years, adopting a new set of standards across the state, every grade level and content area. Adopting a new set of assessments across the state for all grade levels and content areas. Implementing a new accountability system for all districts, and a new evaluation system for every teacher and principal in the state. So that's if you were running a normal organization and you were going to change all of those things about the way your employees did work, you'd want to make a pretty significant investment in making sure they had the training, the support, the development to be able to implement well. And so we made a significant investment in that. And then third and finally, we want to make sure that every kid has the resources that she needs regardless of what her needs may be. And so some of the most underfunded issues in our state are we have continued to underfund our special education costs in the state by about $500 million, which means that you might think, oh, well, that's money that a local district picks up somewhere. As these folks up here can tell you, that is a very, very clear, maybe the clearest federal mandate there is that every school district will educate every child regardless of her special needs and regardless of the cost. So if that child costs you $20,000, you find it. If that child costs you $200,000, you find it. And the place they find it is they just have to pull it from the other dollars that they have available, which means when the state or the federal government doesn't provide those dollars, a district has to just pull from the rest of the dollars allocated to kids who don't have special needs to cover those costs. So we want to invest significantly in special education to both meet the needs of those kids and prevent us balancing the budget on the backs of the kids who don't have identified needs. We want to expand our investment in gifted and talented students, which we know is a significant underserved need in the state. We want to expand resources for that. We want to expand funding into students who are, the percentage of students who are at risk or who are in poverty, and the percentage of students who are learning English as a second language. Both of those populations increasing significantly across the state. Third and final group is what will it take for us to make our K-12 system and the investment therein more transparent, more accountable, more equitable. On transparency, for the first time, we'll be the first state in the country to say every taxpayer will be able to know exactly where every dollar of their taxes goes in K-12 every single day. We'll be able to know that not just to the district level, but to the school level. And so if you will be able to see if you have a son in the system and the state and the district are allocating $6,500 for that student, you'll be able to know exactly where that money is allocated. So you'll be able to know that $50 of that is going to support a district transportation system, and $47 of that goes to the cafeteria, and $120 of that goes to intervention supports, and $4,000 of that goes to salaries, and $140 of that goes to pensions, if you wanted to know that. All of that will be broken out. So you can see exactly where the district's spending money, what investments you like, what investments you don't like. And if you want to call Liz and say, hey, you know what, I'm really delighted that we're spending $47 a student on technology, that's great. I'm really frustrated as to why we're spending $42 a student on intervention systems. Why don't we just put those dollars back at the school level and let them hire more staff if they want to? Why do a centralized investment? So you have real across-the-board transparency for taxpayers and for parents. We'll also do, as a result of this investment, every 4 years what we're calling an ROI study, a return on investment study. So to say, if we make this investment, if we ask the taxpayers to make an investment, they have a right to know, we have a right to know, what we got out of this investment. What were the actual outcomes that were linked to each of these individual investments? So if we invested in extended school days and school years in some places, what results did we get there? If we invested in significant investments in special education, what results did we get there? If we invested in teachers and leaders in these places, what results did we get there? And so everyone will be able to see every 4 years what specific student outcomes were delivered based on those investments. And if we don't like some of those investments, we can change them. And if there's some investments that we think we really like and want to do more of them, we can increase the investment in those places. And then finally, this is the very end, and I'll stop talking, is we want to try to make the funding for K-12 more equitable than it is now, and to make the long-term balancing of the state budget more sustainable than it is now. So two pieces of data that are important here. One is about 30 years ago, 70% of total K-12 funding came from local school districts, and 30% came from the state capital. As of next year, that number will be almost perfectly reversed. Where now 70% of all education funding will come from the state capital, only about 30% will come from local districts. And that has not been by any district's choice. It has been the result of the overlap of Amendment 23 and the Tabor Amendment and the Gallagher Amendment. So what has happened is in 1994, when the last School Finance Act was passed, every district in the state had a uniform mill levy of 40 mills. Everyone paid 40 mils, the same exact rate. So if you had a $200,000 house in Douglas County, or in Delta County, or in Denver County, you paid the same tax rate. What's happened because of Tabor and Gallagher is as assessed valuation has increased in a district, and actually Douglas County is not really an effective district, but you take a place like Telluride. As the assessed valuation has gone up, the property values have increased in Telluride. To offset that under Tabor, what they've done is they've driven down their mill levy rate. So the universe where we sit in right now is right now in 2012, you have a district like Douglas County where you are paying about 25 mils, 25.2 or so mils in your current formula. So call that, for easy math, even though it's not accurate, call that you're paying a 25% property tax rate on your house. It's not purely that because the assessed valuation is discounted, but just for purposes of comparison, you're paying 25% on a $300,000 house right now. You have in this state right now districts who, because of those overlapping formulas, are paying right now 2 mils on the same $300,000 house. So you are paying literally almost 10 to 15 times the tax rate on the same exact piece of property as someone who is paying another district in the state. And after that happens, so you pay 25 mils, they pay 2 mils, and then after they pay their 2 mils, the state comes in and backfills 70% of the cost of that district where they're paying 2 mils. And so there is no relationship between what the local district contributes and what the state matches, other than whatever the formula has forced these districts to do. And so what we've said is, these are districts that, as an example, have about 10 to 15 times more assessed valuation per pupil than Douglas County has, or than Cherry Creek has, or than Littleton has. But the state is backfilling a disproportionate amount of their costs. And then what has happened is, as a result of the state carrying now 70% of the K-12 costs, this is why when you look at the long-term stability of the state budget, people will say, like the DU study, in 15 years, all that will be left for the state to fund is K-12, Medicaid, and prisons. Because K-12 and Medicaid and prisons will eat all the rest of the budget, and there'll be nothing left to fund higher ed, for instance. For those of you that are paying kids, anybody have kids in college right now? Okay, so what you're probably noticing right now is when you wonder where that money came from, our funding for higher ed has gone exactly in the reverse. So 25 years ago, when some of us went to college, the state would pay 70% of the total tuition costs. We would ask students and parents to pick up 30%. As of this year, we're asking students and parents to pick up 70% of the tuition costs, and the state only covers about 30%, as we've cut hundreds of millions of dollars out of higher ed to cover for the hundreds of millions of dollars of K-12 state share that has been increasing over time. And so part of what we want to do is to try to reset that balance both between state and locals and between K-12 and the rest of the budget. And by adjusting that to say, let's first look at what a district's capacity to pay is based on that assessed valuation, and then look at what the state ought to backfill as a result. That creates a little more equity in the formula. I'll tell you that change has zero effect on Douglas County because you're already at 25 mils. Zero effect on Jefferson County because you're already at 25 mils. And so there are none of the metro area districts that are really affected by that adjustment, but it does begin to adjust those places whose mills are way out of whack as a result of the formula. That's the end. The structure is, as you know, we don't have the power to raise revenue at the state capital. That happens by the voters in Colorado, and so this process has 2 steps. One is we will write a finance formula that we think will help drive great outcomes over the next 20 years in the state of Colorado, and we'll try to pass that bill, and if the governor signs it, then what would happen is that question would go to the voters, and the voters would have a decision as to whether or not they think this formula is worth investing in and is it the right formula. And if the voters vote to invest in it, then this would become the new school finance formula and we would fund it. If the voters decide they don't want to invest in it and they would rather keep the formula that we have, then they can vote it down. There's no changes in funding, no changes in policy, and we keep the exact same formula we have now. And so you'll have 2 big chances to weigh in on this question. One is with your elected officials through the vote on the bill in the next month. And the second will be at the ballot. If we, in fact, succeed, then we'll go to the ballot and ask you if you think it's worth investing in, and you can make that decision. So that's the long story made slightly short, probably not short enough, but a little shorter than the 200 pages. And I'll stop there and happy to take questions, thoughts, concerns.
Okay, so we're gonna do DAC questions. And then when we're done with that, I'll look up, maybe open it up. You guys have a mic on that end. I don't know who we want to start with, or who. I'm sure each of us has questions. I know I have quite a few, but I don't want to ever get a mic in front of everyone.
The senator from coming down.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
I was probably behind the same accident you were. I don't know the. Can you hear me without the mic?
No.
No. I was behind the same accident you were, so I understand the frustration. You know, you call it a frustration of coming down to speak to this group. Some of us has called it commute every day.
I know.
But thank you. You know, you don't have to be here. You know, that you could spend your time doing a lot of other things with your own constituents. Instead, you chose to spend your time coming down here, and I just think we owe you a debt of gratitude. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
The rest of the guys aren't as nice, though.
We're fine.
You're the best.
What questions do I have from this end of the table? Do you want to start? You guys have the mic and start down there and move our way back this way or back and forth.
Can you talk a little bit more about the high school piece that you were talking about, the funding following the student and being able to take that and access programs outside of schools?
You bet. So the structure is we're taking it's about $12 million that currently the state cuts back from districts whose students have reduced any of their course load, and we're sending that back to the district to be able to use. But then the structure would be that those students would be able to, what we would hope to build is, and this is kind of still in process, it's kind of an approved provider list that either a district would maintain or that the state would maintain, that would include different programs they could offer. And so we're assuming that's going to be online schools, would be community colleges, and would be four-year colleges. And so those would all be potential providers. And then students would be able to go to those providers, would be able to have credits to pay for them in the same way you might for a concurrent enrollment course. So normally concurrent enrollment, you only have maybe one potential course you can use under the state funding. This would restore those dollars and allow them to do that.
So currently in our district, we have concurrent enrollment classes that are offered in our high schools. We have an agreement with Arapahoe Community College where we have teachers that are certified both high school and college. Could we use those dollars to offset the cost of those instructors in our own buildings?
Exactly.
As opposed to, so the decision making around where to direct those dollars would be from a district perspective and not necessarily from someone coming in saying, I want to go take a class at DU. Can you pay for that for me?
So the dollars would be in the district's control. So yes, it would be district's choice. And the hope is that obviously the students would have some input on what they want to study, where they want to go. But exactly that kind of course, we did those in my high school too. I was a high school principal in Portland for 4 years. And so we did those programs also. And I think that's exactly the kind of program we want to support, is to be able to buy down the cost of, hey, we're already doing concurrent enrollment here on campus, but we got to share the cost with whoever it might be, Arapahoe Community College or whatnot, would be able to do that. That's exactly right.
And then the other question I had was around facility. I think one of the challenges that we're going to have is if that full-day kindergarten piece goes through as it's written, we're immediately going to be in a capacity, not crisis, but we're going to have some issues with being able to have spaces to provide that. Is there going to be access for districts that have those kind of capacity issues for additional dollars to build additional classrooms or portables or whatever that may look like?
It's a great question, and I'm going to admit it's a bit of a problem. We don't, as you also may know, there are huge capital construction problems all over the state, even the kindergarten issue aside. So we have about $18 billion of, sort of like the Department of Transportation budget, all the roads are falling apart. We've got about $18 billion of schools falling apart as well. And we've never had in the school finance formula capital construction. So it's just not, and some states have it, our formula never has had it, which is why we pass all the costs off to the local districts, unfortunately, to fund capital construction. So we don't have any funding in the bill for construction for kindergarten. What we did do, and some people were upset about this, but it was a way to try to accommodate districts, is the language does not mandate that every district provide for the kindergarten. It says that we are going to provide the resources for you to be able to do it. And so if you are not able to do it because you can't find the capital construction needs, or you're able to do it in some schools, not others, or you're able to partner with other, like on the early childhood side, I think we'll have a lot of partnering with outside providers who will provide that out other than just the district. but we do know that there's a space issue, and the hope was that by providing those dollars and not doing any clawback for existing local dollars on K-12, that we would provide some additional resources that could help in facilities. And so it doesn't solve the facilities problem, but our hope is it gives you some flexibility to spend them where you think is best.
Could you have the panel introduce themselves so we know who you are and you have a name?
Absolutely. Why don't we take a second for that right now and start with Dan. We'll move this way.
Sorry, I'm Dan McMinamy. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Education for Douglas County.
I'm Ron Booth. I'm a community member. Our community, Douglas County. I live in Castle Rock.
I mean, the district accountability?
Yes, the District Accountability Committee. Thank you for that clarification.
I'm Megan Silverthorne on the Board of Education here in Douglas County.
Judy Reynolds, Secretary for the DAC.
David DiCarlo, I'm the chair of the DAC parent.
Kevin Larson, Vice President of the School Board.
That Benevento School Board.
Thank you.
I just had a question of clarification, Senator Johnston. I wasn't sure whether I caught this correctly regarding the high school schedule, that if the kids are enrolled and let's say there's a 7-period day and they're enrolled in 6 classes, they have, that 7th class could not be an unscheduled hour. Is that true? I mean, they have to go to a community college or take something online or?
Great question. No, we are, what we're doing is we're ceasing to audit you. We're ceasing to audit every high school student's schedule in the state anymore and try to pull money back from you. We're going to give you full funding for that student, even if that 7th period, I mean, if you and the student together decide that the best thing for you for 7th period is to have an off hour, you can still do that. But what you also could do is you could have funding for her to do the concurrent enrollment if she wanted. And so we're just saying that we believe your district is going to be a good steward with the parent of what the best plan is for that kid. And so, it might also be that you want to do an internship, for that afternoon, or she wants to go to she wants to be an architect, and she's going to spend 2 hours an afternoon at an architecture firm. And so we don't require them to do that. We just make resources available for you to choose to do that you and the student choose to.
I think every high school principal would appreciate that flexibility because the local control is huge for the community, especially the high schools. But in many ways, you had mentioned the academic achievement in terms of being compared with the industrialized nations throughout the world and how we are not doing well. You mentioned the top 4% of our kids don't match up with.
So I was just making the point that even our top quartile of kids, the top 25% of kids, so you can do kind of our best versus their best, like if it was a tennis tournament, our number 1 against our number 1.
Yeah.
Our top quartile against the rest of the world's top quartile, we're still not in the top 25.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because of the intervention required for kids that are not achieving. Direct instruction is the best way to get those kids back on to speed. And we have various assessments that can pinpoint that. And I think it's crucial schools build in for kids that are not doing as well in academic achievement, that they have direct instruction during the day through tutoring or direct intervention. It's huge, especially for the high school kids, but K-12, it's very important. The other thing I was going to ask you is you had mentioned special education. What % of our special education budget is funded by the federal government?
Great question. The answer is not very much.
It's about 11%.
There you go. So,
well, it's like an unfunded mandate.
I would say it's the largest unfunded mandate in the country, probably.
And then you worry about the kids that are high achieving, the gifted and talented kids, which are many more than the kids that are disabled or limited in some ways. We're real good with interventions. It's the kids that really excel. We can go ahead and schedule them into ACC or online and things like that. But there's got to be more creativity in terms of addressing the really academically powerful kids. And it forces teachers and principals to get real creative, to take everyone to a higher level. And that's what I was hoping we would do, but I really like what you had to say about local control and funding. That is huge, because people buy their property and home in Douglas County because of the schools. That's one of the first questions that are asked of realtors.
Thank you. Great point. And just to add, I totally agree with you on the gifted and talented. That's why we're proposing adding 50%. I mean, a 50% increase to the gifted and talented budget for just that reason. It's a population that's gotten lost, I think, significantly. And so we want to put that back. Won't be enough yet, but it'll be a good start.
Well, I'm so glad you come down and help us understand
No,
what's in your legislation. I did have a question. I know that that you're part of the goal of your piece of legislation is to address inequities and that sort of thing. I know I've heard a lot of concern from citizens regarding taxes and levels of funding and that sort of thing. So here in Douglas County, I think because of the nature of our demographics, we have a lower at-risk population and those sorts of factors that contribute to our funding level, that we essentially have become net givers of dollars to the state in terms of what we get back from the state, what we give to the state. And I hope you'll address a little bit about what you see your bill doing in that regard. I know that recent events in the legislature have created floors for funding and all of that, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
You bet. And this is great because this is the one room in the state where I'll be popular for this amendment because the other ones I was not so popular. But so you're right. So and just for folks in the room, Douglas County is one of the lowest funded districts in the state. So you're at around $6,200 or $6,300 per student right now. The lowest funded districts in the state are $6,200. So you're very close to the bottom. And so the preliminary increase from the formula had Douglas County up about $300 or $400 per student. I proposed last week a floor funding amendment, which would have said that all districts should be funded at least a minimum of $7,000, which is technically it's 94% of basically the statewide average. To say exactly right, no matter what the circumstances of the formula or of the districts, we should make sure that every kid has at least a basic level of funding. And so that amendment that I authored and proposed would have cost about $42 million, and $20 million of it would come to Douglas County because it's a $300 plus per pupil increase just for Douglas County. Because you are one of the lowest funded districts and you're one of the largest. And so when you lift the floor for everybody, Douglas County is a pretty heavy floor to lift because of the number of kids. And so there was some sort of strange politics around it, and some folks who I thought would vote for it voted against it. And so there was a different amendment that got on, which was a $300 million amendment, which raises the floor for everybody to $7,500, which is sort of a never land amendment that's not possible to fund. And so I don't think that will stay, but I will continue to fight for this floor funding amendment to make sure that Douglas County gets brought up significantly closer to the statewide average, because I think that regardless of the formula, regardless of local tax policies or whatever local districts choose or not choose to do on overrides, I think we have an obligation to make sure all kids have a basic floor of adequacy, and so I propose that, and I'll fight for it again when it gets to the floor. You bet.
I have a question that goes back to the pre-K and full day kindergarten.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that the state constitution allows for public education 5 through, is it 20 or 21?
You're right.
How does this work around that part of our state constitution without actually changing our state constitution?
That's a great question. So that range is what the state is obligated to fund by constitutional requirement. So we have no choice but to fund that. It's obviously permissive for us to fund other things, right? We still provide, for instance, a COF value, which is the way we fund higher education. If you're a 22-year-old senior at CU, we're still giving you higher ed funding, even though you're outside that 21-year window. And so it's sort of a floor, I guess, and not a ceiling of what we're required to do. And so, and basically the reason why we're doing it is we're seeing that it so dramatically reduces our costs for the 6 and 7 and 8-year-olds if we have some of these 4 and 5-year-olds who are coming in better prepared to start school, because it drives down all the costs of our intervention. So it's sort of like diversionary programs save money on corrections programs if you can get kids into an intervention. I guess that's not a great parallel to make for a 4-year-old, but the idea is our hope is it's a long-term financial saver to say if we invest some in those kids before first grade, they're less likely to need more resources later.
Okay, and around that question, with the preschool portion of that. Is it my understanding that that will be in partnership with private preschools in addition to public preschools, or that what are the guidelines for
That's
that?
correct. So that currently, the way the Colorado preschool program currently works is parents can choose to go to whichever provider they want. That includes public providers, includes private providers, includes religious providers, and so the current Colorado preschool program, that's how that works, and this would expand that program, so that choice is still in place for parents. Okay.
I have so many questions. I don't know.
We can do like a speed round, right? Try to just answer one-word answers.
Well, I try to keep up with the bill, as it's changed and morphed and, over the course of time. The thing I keep coming back to sort of piggyback a little bit off of Director Silverthorne's question is the net giver scenario. So I look at education, I guess, as it's a four-legged table, and so this table right here, if I take a leg out from underneath it, it's a tripod and it's not very stable. And to me, this is just personal philosophy, but each leg is represented by something different. So we have a student leg, a teacher leg, a funding leg, parent community leg. And when we start talking about children and the differences in cost of educating them, depending on where they live in the state and the different reasons behind that, some of those legs are more anemic than others, and some kids, no matter what community, one of the legs or maybe a couple are missing. And the net giver, or the moving of dollars, I guess presupposes that any one of these legs could be made big enough to hold the whole table up. And I guess I look at the current formula, and I commend the efforts you've got going on to try to change it, because we have a sort of a running joke down here about 23 Gallagher table. We call it Twi-Gallagher, because it's this fatal intersection with the three just mangled. And what you get out the other end, I mean,
that's good. I've heard that.
Copernicus would scream that the earth is flat, throw his arms up, and say that the sun revolves around us. So I just guess I'm wanting to understand how we're going to weigh factors and decide if, I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this, but the amendment that raises the floor, our graduation percentage, which is how I kind of distill it down, because it's one thing that I can look at each district and say, how are you doing? It's 87.4%. I don't want to say that's entirely demographic, because I'm not looking to insult our teachers. They do a really hard job and they do a fine job. I look at some of the other districts and theirs is far less, and I don't want to insult those teachers saying, sure, you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
But I don't know how the money alone fills in the hole. And like I said, the bill's 200 pages long. I don't see any community or parental responsibility. And I don't know that large urban districts can survive or create success, lasting success, without sustained, lasting, and meaningful parental input. And I don't know how money from here fixes that leg of the table. So raising the floor here, it's sort of like when minimum wage goes up, I guess. I don't go up with it. So my dollars become worth a little less in the economy. I don't quite know how it's going to impact those districts. And the measuring piece, if those anemic legs stay anemic even though the investment goes up, what are we looking at? So I think is it 2020 that is when the first measurement, right? That was one of the versions I saw.
That's correct.
At that point,
the funding doesn't start until 2016.
Yeah, so it's right. So it's not like it starts next. Yeah,
that's right.
So we got about 4 years in at that point. What happens then? Because this is such a colossal. This is almost a Sisyphean task you've taken on. You're pushing that boulder uphill, and it may be 4 years before we know if it's going to roll back down.
Yeah.
What's the plan then? I know that's kind of a broad
question, but it's a great question.
What's the plan at that point?
And so, a couple of things. One is, in this case, sort of, you are actually the minimum wage employee in this case. Raising the floor actually helps Douglas County most directly. Now, your question is, what increased return on investment will we get on that? I don't believe that money by itself is the solution. And so the folks who thought, well, the answer is just more revenue without any change to how the system operates, I don't agree with that. And the folks who thought, well, we can do everything we want to do on the same allocation, I don't quite agree with that either. There are some things like full day K and even the capital construction costs you mentioned, that if you want to do that, you can't do that really on existing funds. And so what we've tried to do is take what are the most targeted set of investments that we think generate the most significant set of results, and then how will we know if we're right or wrong. And so, you know, this package is in the range of $800 to $950 million. I think it's a big investment. But if you look at, for instance, the Lovato lawsuit right now, where the state has been sued for being unconstitutionally underfunding our schools, that number says we're about $4.7 billion under what we should be funding. That's, the question for me is not, do we need $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion or $4 billion? The question for me, like you, is what more results on student outcomes do I get for $1 billion? And what do I get for 1.5 and 2 and 2.5 and 3 and 3.5? And my belief is, for the taxpayers of the state, we ought to start at that smallest possible number. And I know you might say this is a large one to start with, but to say, let's first make a sort of the initial investment and see what kind of return we get on that investment, and see if those investments are meaningful, get us what we want in terms of outcomes, where they generate results and where they don't. And then if they don't, you can change all those investments. And so I think it's not a static one point in time, here's how we'll fill the cup and then we'll be done. We'll still be, if this passes, we will still be $1,500 per student underfunded from just the average state in America. We'll be $8,000 per student underfunded from the top performing state in America. So this is not in any way going to put Colorado on the top of the pile. It'll put us still in the bottom third or bottom quarter of the pile. And so I don't think that the theory alone is that the money makes all the difference. I think money strategically invested with real transparency and real accountability does make a target difference, and in the hands of competent people with the good involvement of their communities. And so I think that is the theory of change here, but that's why you have to check in to say taxpayers have a right to know if it doesn't bear out. But I think better to have the people control this decision than the court control this decision, which is our other option.
I absolutely agree, the people controlling it as opposed to courts. And like Lovato, like you said, it's not even an economic possibility. $4.7 billion from where? I think the part of it that maybe gets overlooked, the ability to react at the most local possible level, as Dan and Lon were sort of touching on, makes a difference. And I know here in Douglas County, I've been educated in 2 major cities in the United States, and it's a lot different here because I can walk into a building and see my kid's principal and have an idea on a Monday, and it's in place on Thursday if it's within their budget and they like the idea. Yeah. Whereas other districts around the state, it could take 4 years to wade through their levels just to be told no.
And an act of Congress.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And that local control piece to me is crucial to our success. It's not just a question, like I was speaking earlier, of weighing demographics. It's site-based budgeting. It's a whole bunch of different things that we do differently here that allow quicker reaction and better reaction to localized education and the problems that come up, quite frankly, with localized education. So I look at some of the districts that benefit more heavily from this, and that structure is very different, and it is much more driven top-down. To me, in some ways, this fights physics. When I throw a rock in a pond, the ripples will always go outward. And when we talk education funding, that outer ring with the smallest wave and the least effectiveness is definitely the federal government. For Douglas County, their dollars could go amiss and we would barely even notice it. For other districts, not so much. And the strings that come attached with that money, of course, force those districts. I feel for them because it forces them to deploy different parts of their budget that they may spend better locally with local control, local decision-making authority, to have better outcomes than what's being forced now. My concern, I guess, and I don't want to steal any Director Larson's thunder here, because I know he's thinking somewhat down the same lines as some of this, but my concern is that the more investment that happens at the state level, the less investment that will be encouraged or followed at a local level. For a community like Douglas County, there's a big difference in what we send to the state and what comes back. And that's a tough pill to swallow when you're faced with hard times like we have for the last several years. So That's just sort of so you understand where my thought process comes with this and why I look at this and say, you know.
And I think that's fair. I think that's a fair question. I think that, that's why voters in your situation may say, I'd rather just not do this. I'd rather not have new K-12 funding, and we'll solve this locally, even if it means we're one of the lowest funded districts in the state. If we need more money, we'll ask our voters for it. I think that is one option. I think the challenge is that the Fly-Gal, as you were saying, has so distorted what the local formulas are that I think there does need some state action to try to readjust that. And it's very hard to readjust that without new revenue, because you'll see a lot of districts that will drop, and to try to balance that and some of the gain. And so the benefit of having all districts win under this formula is you can say, yeah, we think there is some place for the state, and part of that might be ensuring some floor funding for all districts, ensuring some increases for all districts along with transparency and accountability. We do actually have site-based budgeting as part of the proposal here, so there is more autonomy for principals around the control of some of these weighted dollars as a way to say, let's let these folks have the autonomy to make decisions, and then let their parents and communities and superintendents hold accountable if they don't do well. And so a number of those ideas are in here. There are some significant investments for charters here. I didn't mention if there are folks in the crowd interested in that to help try to balance some of the inequities around charter school funding. And so there are some other components of it which I think help address some of those inequities that come up around different structures of schools in the state. And also around saying we do think the goal is to drive more and more dollars locally. And sometimes that means not just to the district, but actually to the site. So I think that's met with a number of Douglas County's principals who work under this system and really like it. And so we have tried to emulate some of that.
Well, again, thank you for being here. There are a number of things in the proposal. I had the joy of being at the hearing last Tuesday, 2 until 11:20.
I'm glad you called it joy, because I don't think anybody else did.
Yeah. There was a sarcasm font.
Yes.
And there are a number of things I think are admirable and I think are good. I like the average daily membership, although I'm not sure, are we going to, once we figure them out a moving average, are we going to use the previous years or the current years and adjust
the
those?
Previous years and then adjust up.
Okay, so there's still a little lag.
There's a little lag, yeah. We don't want to try to mess with your budgets in the middle of the year and we've already hired teachers. It's hard for us to say. We don't want to retract money in the middle of the year.
And then the goal of equity, the idea of getting a return on investment are all things that sound great, and I like that we're making efforts in that. But as one of our late local radio celebrities said, there's always a however, and so this is my however. I need to start, and a lot of times I think people don't understand when we're talking about local and state funding. Just around the room, just a general question in the room. Where do you think, when you're paying money to support Douglas County schools, how are you doing that, Dave?
Through property tax.
Through property tax. That's always the first thing that comes to mind. And that's the local contribution that's going into funding. And in fact, if people want to know, in Douglas County with our mill rate and the ratcheting down of the amount of your tax or assessed home value that's actually taxable, if you take your home property value and take off the last 3 digits and multiply by 4, that's about what you're paying to Douglas County School District if you're a Douglas County resident. Now,
good shorthand.
Yeah, and
how many mills are you total? Are you
about 48, just under 50. It's like really high. Yeah, when you take the base 25.44 that you mentioned,
you have 25.
You talk the debt service, and then you have mill levy override that we passed. So if you take essentially 8% of your home value, and just about a 50 mil comes about.
So we can write that down. It's a good cheat sheet.
If your commercial property, some of you own businesses and pay commercial property taxes, instead of multiplying by 4, multiply by 14. Okay. Now, so you can figure out what you're paying and supporting your schools locally through the property tax, and that's and then in addition, of course, there's some vehicle personal ownership tax. But the piece that funds state funding of education is through largely the income tax and sales tax. And with our 4.63%, and if you add how much of your income you spend on sales tax, I use a good proxy of roughly 5% of income is going to the state in terms of the income and sales tax. And if roughly 40% of our state budget is K-12 education, that means about 2% of your income is going toward K-12 education. So now, second part of the exercise, take your family's income, take off the last 3 digits again, and take that value times 20. And that's your household's contribution to the combined formula that's going to education. So your local taxes are going in there, and so is your income tax. If you take your income, take off the 3 digits, multiply by 20. For many people in Douglas County, that's a bigger contribution than your property tax. A lot of you are quite aware of your property tax. You didn't realize your income tax was actually a big part of this funding. And due to Tweed Galivore, which Dave and I concocted over a meeting a couple years ago, that has just what you said. It's flipped the ratio from 30-70 state local to 70-30. And I would love to see us, and you know, it can't be all unwound at one time, but I did go to some of those TBD meetings, and that was what our table came up with, untangle those guys.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of steps that have to go into that.
Gallagher's the biggest one, I think.
I think so, because that's what's ratcheted our home assessed value down to the 8%.
Yeah.
Now, given that, and we want to have equity, you have constituents you have to answer to, and certainly as an elected local school board member, I have the same thing. So I think my main constituents are the kids in this district that we need to educate, and the taxpayers who provide the resources to fund those kids. And, oh goodness, I just went on the internet and looked at, oh, did this go to sleep? There we go. We're up to 27 different possible proposed school funding titles.
I have not read them yet.
There's one that has 16 permutations, another one that has 8. But essentially they're the same language with little things tweaked in and out. But what I did is took our current situation and I took our the proposals under the original bill and with some of the amendments in them. And I just did some charts so that I could just see, how this works out. So this is the current situation, current formula. And what I did is I created a baseline that just said if every kid in the entire state, every district got the same amount per pupil as a marker, and then of course if you took that times the number of pupils in your district, then compare what you actually receive under the present formula and compare that, you can get all 178 school districts plotted along this chart. And so on the left side, well, in the middle is actually about 139 districts where it's all within $1 million of the end, so there's not much swing. But when you go to the left end, you go to the right end, you're seeing the districts that, due to the factors that are in the present formula, either are well under that average number. Douglas County leading the way at 16 million under, Jeffco right behind at 13. A handful that are somewhere between 5 and 10. And then on the other side, you've got Aurora that's plus 10 and Denver that's plus 31 to that average line. Now, I took the original Senate Bill 213 without the floor. And I deliberately kept, you notice this graph's kind of compact, it doesn't use the entire vertical range because I saved it for the next piece, which is the original 213 without the floor, which is actually one of the 27 funding possibilities that was submitted by the chamber. In case this doesn't go through the legislature, it'll be an initiative.
Would not be funded at a 2-page blue book.
I believe it's the original, so it doesn't have any of the amendments in it, so it's going to be the original language.
Okay. They can amend it through the process, so they can follow us potentially. I don't think that's going to come to fruition, but it is interesting.
Okay, well that's good to know. I didn't know what the mechanics were. So there you go. And now the entire span of the vertical axes are reached, where originally that had Douglas at 4,500. Now, granted, that whole average did go up, so we did actually see some additional money come in, but it left us 45 under that PAR line, if you want to call it, and then Jeffco at 30. Cherry Creek moved into the left side of the range, farther from where they had been in the mid-20s, and then on the right end you see some new districts. Commerce City and Westminster now are in the double-digit plus side. Aurora has jumped into where Denver used to be with over 30, and Denver now at a 73 million above average. And then I did implement I did take a look with the amended floor. How does that change? And this does bring that back somewhat. It does still leave some. The floor doesn't reduce the funding on it. It just raises the average. So in fact, Denver's bar coming down just means the average went up. And then I took all three scenarios and plotted them together just so we can get an appreciation. The bar gets skinnier and a little harder to discern, but I've got the ability to put this out where people can see it. But when I'm seeing that much tilt, it's got me concerned that for our children, are we getting the right value? Are we getting equity in the system in terms of the dollars that they should be getting? And I understand that if you've got higher needs identified, there needs to be some dollars. But do we have any studies going into this that say, this is kind of the question Lobato screens for. Do we have a measurement of what the bare minimum adequate funding level is for somebody with no identified significant needs? And then do we marginally have English language learner needs? Do we have special ed needs? And do we have anything that quantifies those? And do we have anything then that correlates the drivers in the formula to indicate that that's measured? Take at risk, for example, and we use a proxy under this formula of free and reduced lunch. Currently it's free lunch, but now it's free and reduced lunch. And then defining English language learners. But what it does is it takes all of these factors at a district level. It even has a quadratic formula. It's truly a complex formula because I think there was even an initial version that had a negative inside in the radical, which as a math geek, I'm an actual.
We try to make it as advanced as possible.
As a math coach, I truly appreciate that it was complex. But what we're seeing is that at risk and those English language learners then drive the funding levels for that district. It doesn't necessarily, we haven't quantified it down to the kid level so that it truly can follow them. So let's just take an interesting example. Douglas County has a lot of Hope Online kids. A lot of them are Denver residents. And in fact, the title money from the federal government that follows them goes to Denver because they reside in Denver, yet they go to a Douglas County school. And Douglas County in the formula is the lowest level of this at-risk calculation. And so those kids who truly are at risk aren't seeing that funding follow them in. And yet in Denver, if somebody, I've got friends who have a kid at, say, Steele Elementary School, and who they're actually quite fine financially, and their child is not identified at risk, but that kid carries a higher at-risk funding dollar because he's a Denver resident.
That kid wouldn't get any at-risk funding dollars if he's not in poverty.
So the district gets them, but then how are, and I know presently, isn't it 75% of at-risk dollars have to be used at risk, and then
they have to follow. So
the converse says that 25% of it can actually be used to subsidize other things. Is that changed in?
So this, so many things to respond to because you have so many
I'm sorry,
points. No, it's okay. I'm just trying to think of I want to make sure I'm responsive in the right order. The short answer is, so it would the bill now requires those dollars to actually follow students to the school where they go. And so if you are in a school if you're at risk and you're in a school in Douglas County or you're at risk and you're in a school in Denver, all of the state share of those dollars have to follow those kids to the school where they go. We don't control the local share, obviously, so the local share is centrally administered, but the state share all have to follow that actual identified child to that actual identified school.
Now, I also heard a witness at last week's hearing bring up a situation where, let's say you've got a kid who's got the option, proximity to go to 4 different school districts. A kid from Tanzania is 9 years old, learning English, and their family's in poverty. And if they went to Jeffco, the dollars following that kid were $1,200 less than if that kid went to Denver. And so I'm having trouble following the follow of the kid aspect of the formula.
So, and this will get a little complicated for folks, but I want to answer your question accurately. So there is currently in state law, and there will continue to be in state law, a weighted formula concentrated by poverty. So what that means is, currently the formula says, if you have a low concentration of students in poverty, call it 10%, in Douglas County is 8 maybe, then you get the weight at the bottom of the range, which is 10%. So all kids have a 10% weight. That weight goes up to 30% in the current formula. So the research suggests as the concentration of poverty gets higher, the costs to meet those needs get higher. So if you are in a district that is at 50% free reduced lunch, then your concentration goes from the 10% weight up to the 20% weight. If you're in a district that's at 100% free reduced lunch, like say Center, Colorado, you go to the top weight, which is 30%. So it is currently, and it works just like the federal income tax code, which is like your first 30% of kids come in at the lowest weight, your next 30 at the next weight, and the next. So if you're Aurora, not all of your kids are funded at the 30% weight. It's only the percentage over the statewide average. You know, and so at each, it's really complicated, but you love math, so you understand. At each marginal percentage increase, you go up 0.4% of the weight, and so, but you're only getting that marginal increase per weight. So it's not as if every Aurora student that comes in is now funded at 40%, and every Douglas County is funded at 20%. It's only the marginal change per student. Now, to your point, we do have a proposed amendment that I think I'm going to offer, which is to say, should we calculate that concentration of poverty by school and not by district? So I won't use Douglas County, but say use Cherry Creek in Aurora as an example. So you have, Cherry Creek is maybe 10% free reduced lunch. Maybe it's 20%, I don't know the number. It's about, maybe it's well below the state average. But within Cherry Creek, you might have 80 schools that are 5% free reduced lunch and 10 schools that are 90% free reduced lunch. And so the argument was, well, if I'm at a 90% free reduced lunch school in Cherry Creek, or I'm at a 90% free reduced lunch school in Aurora, shouldn't that funding be the same because the concentration in that building is the same? And so I think that's a good policy argument, which is part of what you're making. And so we have proposed potentially changing that factor from being a district-based weight to a school-based weight. So if the concentration is high in one school, then the weights would be high in that one school, and not in the others. So I think that's the case.
Now, would it be unreasonable to even drive it to the child level?
Well, so the reason why it's not driven to the child level is because the costs change in aggregate, right? So as a former teacher, or a principal, if you have a classroom of 25 kids that has one student who is in poverty and 24 who are not, that student requires some extra resources. But if you have a classroom of 25 kids where 24 of them are in poverty and one of them is not, those resources needs escalate, and so that's why the concentrations change based on. So this is why if you were a student in Cherry Creek, the same student under our new plan could go to the school that's 5% free reduced lunch and they would bring fewer dollars with them, or they would go to the school that's 90% and they would bring more dollars with them, not because that child necessarily is more expensive than one or the other, but in the different context, what the additive cost of that child is different. And then the last part to come back to is if you look at the formula, the inequities, the most dramatic inequities in the formula are driven by the size factor. And so I thought you might bring this graph, so I have sort of another piece of data to show you. I'll hand it out to you all, and then I'll hand it out to the folks who look out in the audience as well. So this shows you the distribution of funding of districts across the state. What it shows you is the lighter gray bar is the bill as introduced. The darker gray bar is the bill as amended with the floor funding amendment. So what you'll see is the most, you'll see, these 42 districts were the ones that all saw the floor funding increases, and most of them are all large districts, and so that $300 million of the floor funding goes mostly to Douglas, Jefferson, Cherry Creek, Boulder, and Littleton. But what you'll see is the real disparity here is not between Littleton and Cherry Creek or between Cherry Creek and Aurora. The real gap is between Agate, which is getting almost 3 times the funding per student of Cherry Creek. It's around $18,000 per student. And that is because of the size factor. So Agate has about 44 students in it total, the entire district. So its entire budget is almost $1 million. But when you divide that per pupil, it's around 18,000. And so what you'll see as the most significant differences here are the result of the size factor, not the result of the at-risk or the LL factor. And this is why what I think was confusing about, obviously you're a math fan, so what's confusing about your graph is the multiplier effect of larger districts, right? So I can tell you right here, for instance, You have on here Center, Colorado as one of these very small bars. Center, Colorado is seeing a $2,600 per student increase under the new formula. That's almost 3 times the increase of, say, Aurora, and 8 times the increase of Aspen, which are showing up higher on your graphs because those districts have 8 to 100 times more students. So if you take a $5 difference and multiply it 80,000 times in Denver or Douglas County's cases, the disparities look much larger. The gaps are actually much smaller per student. The biggest gaps per student are between the small rural districts and between the big urban ones. But among the big urban districts, or the big districts, all big districts, the gaps are actually not nearly so large. And so I just lay this out as I think a balance to show where these districts are vis-a-vis floor funding and where they are vis-a-vis each other. Because I think the actual funding gaps, when you look at the actual dollar amount they're getting in their bank accounts, are not nearly so broad unless you're talking about the size factor. And the size factor is another example that we still recognize in this state that different students and different structures cost different dollars, and the most expensive structure right now is a district that's 47 kids. And so we subsidize that with the largest factor.
Right. And I sure understand it. And if you added all those smallest districts together, the aggregate impact they have on the whole picture is very
It's
small.
only 70 million.
And that's why I certainly don't want to ignore them, but that's why they're in that little space in my charts was in terms of if you're trying to figure out where you're moving dollars from one end to the other, even keeping them whole, because I think even on the high end, the floor didn't do anything to a district that went from 14,000 down to 13,500.
Correct.
They actually saw a significant hurt, and that didn't. I think even to keep them whole it'd be a negligible cost in the big picture of what we're looking at.
And can I just add one thing is to keep in mind, this amendment was sort of on the Narnia budget, and so they put in $300 million with no way to account for it. And so I will actually have to account for these dollars. And so what will functionally happen on any version of the floor amendment is if you put in a statewide floor, then every district that's below that floor is insured that floor, right? So you can't cut money out of those districts to fill that cost. So what you'll have to do by definition is pull money from the rest of the 140 districts who are not covered by the floor amendment to subsidize that floor amendment. So de facto, this will not just,
or you have to add it.
Or you have to add to the pie, right? And so not adding to the pie, what you would do is you'll both pull up all the districts by the floor, and you will pull down the districts at the top. So this will actually, and then when you actually have to budget this amendment, it will take your levers and do this. Once we actually figure out how to fund it, if you pull it out of the existing budget.
So that was the part about the constituents of the kids, and now when I'm looking from the perspective of the taxpayers,
Yep.
this is a hard thing to find, revenue by district. So the closest thing I could come up with was by county. And at least in our district, we do have a little corner of Elbert County, but pretty much Douglas County is the Douglas County.
Yeah, I've never seen this before.
And this was it's something on the 2012 Revenue Department's thing, and the latest they have data for is 2009. So what this does is shows by county the number of returns, the amount of taxes paid, both federal, Colorado on a gross basis and a net basis. I haven't yet determined what gross and net differences are.
So those are in thousands, right? Those
are all in thousands,
Yeah.
and then of course the ratios come out. But what you'll see is that essentially right about here, I've got Douglas County highlighted in yellow. The statewide average or totals are in green, and so roughly 9.5% of the income taxes drawn for the state of Colorado come from Douglas County. Our share of number of students that are the state population are 7.5%. And the formulas that we're getting are by definition less than that because of showing that if we had gotten average funding, we're below that number. And in fact, to the degree I've got that available here. Here is 7.5% of the statewide students are enrolled in Douglas County. In terms of the new funds, originally proposed, Douglas County was going to get about 3.25%. And with the floor now, we're getting about just under 7%. So we're still getting less in the funds with that floor than we have in the terms of numbers of students. And both of those numbers are quite a couple percentage points behind the share of income taxes we're putting into the state. So there's no question that Douglas County is being a good neighbor and contributing to this state system. And so if at least you're going to continue the current system, then we're already dealing with an existing disadvantage. The original proposal was so strong that it really had a distaste in our mouth, and I know your original floor mitigated that somewhat. I think it brought us up somewhat, but it's still, to be able to go to our constituency, I guess here's what I'd say, is even with the additional money that the new floor would bring, Senator Johnston, was Douglas County voters, if we need to get, let's say, some additional money into Douglas County to fund the needs that we've identified, if I gave you a 3A and 3B option to do it, 100% of the money would stay here in Douglas County and you get it. The alternative is we can go with Senate Bill 213 and a much smaller return is going to come in. And that's what, and not only if we're doing that, and then we do identify local needs, we're hampered because our constituents are feeling like, I'm tapped. We put those resources into a statewide solution. And that's why I really wish we would go back to the drawing board. I know you spent the last year and a half or so working with a number of groups. I'm only a year and a quarter on the board, but I know that this board and our superintendent, and I know he's talked to some, but I think there are a number of districts that feel they would want to be a bigger part of coming up with this solution. I know you said the first ROI study is going to come in 2020. And what I'd rather do, rather than try to hurry in 2013 to come up with a system that we're going to eventually have 2020 hindsight, I'd rather take a breather, come up with a more comprehensive solution that looks at truly, I don't want us to just go to 60-40 state local. I'd like to see us go back to something feasible at the 37 level, and I'd rather go into 2014 foresight than 2020 hindsight. That's how I'm looking at it right now. Anytime I'm investing anything into, whether it's my personal life or whether it's at a governmental level, I want to see a viable return. And I think right now Douglas County is not feeling it under the original and even amended scenarios. So that's some of the concerns I wanted to bring to the table. That you could be aware of.
Very helpful. Can I ask you a question in return? If that number were, so if the return were the same as the investment, would you anticipate that you would and your board would support it? So if it was a 7% return on 7% of the student population.
And how is that going to be possible? Do you really see it? And not just the way that the new dollars, new investment dollars go in, that bring us actually back to that on the overall, when you take the old dollars and the new dollars together and bring us closer to, yes, the money we're getting back is closer to the money we're putting in. I think we'd have to take a look at that. That's what we haven't seen to date now, and I think we need to. The other thing too is that the framers of the Constitution, when they were looking at education and how they're going to set it up, a number of states set up there with a superintendent of public instruction, a very state-centric set of governments. And then they also considered, should we have this more done at the local level and have state oversight function? And they chose the latter, largely because they felt that the solutions and the accountability being closer to the people was going to be something that was better for each of those communities. And so I think it's very hard to come up, as much as I like a complex formula, I think it's hard to prescribe one that works for 178 different school districts in the state that actually comes out and is equitable, fair, and addresses the needs. And I would rather leave an umbrella, some safety net level of funding that we could have at the state level, but put the bulk of money back into local hands where their constituents that can hold them accountable. And if they don't feel they're doing the right things with the dollars, they're going to vote them out, and they're going to get a board that will actually do those things and they feel are the right steps. So I'm looking at an even bigger picture than that. I would rather see a local-centric solution in the state.
So I think I've looked at this, and the challenge is to do that would require you to go to your voters and ask them to raise significant property taxes and significant new millages. And so if you wanted to readjust the 70-30 split back to 30-70, you'd have to restore back to 40 mils, essentially, which would be
and you're right,
a major property tax hike for your district, which would be even more proportionally than other districts because of the higher property tax value.
Right. But what I want to do is get an exchange. I want to get a refund of that 2% of the income tax, or maybe not all 2 of it, maybe 1.5 or 1.6 of it. Leave a fraction in so the state can be in an oversight position. What I'd like to do, because I think Douglas County taxpayers will be able to see that their portion that's going into the income taxes, they were able to, and you need to do it where you vote to say, yes, we're going to take that money that we're putting into a state system that's being, I don't know, I guess it's being bused to other districts without our ability to account for them. We've got more of our dollars that Douglas County contributes that go in, on a net basis, go into other districts, and we have no say over what's going on.
Same is true of Denver. Denver
Sure.
is a significant net tax contributor.
And so what we could do is say, okay, we'll take those dollars and whether we convert them into a property tax-based tax or have a local, I'm really trying to keep myself out of the box of any constraints we've already had. So I don't want to pile up new taxes and keep the existing state system. I would like to exchange it so that we're actually redirecting the money directly locally and then have a solution. Because the last thing I want to do is jack everybody's property tax and do nothing in return at the state level.
So I mean, it's a fascinating idea. We should talk more about it. I'd say one thing I would raise is the constitutional Gallimore, problem. And so one thing we have tried to take a look at is how can you begin to put some guardrails on this to prevent that from making the situation worse as it is, and then what is the long-term strategy to try to undo that knot a little bit. And so there is still, I think what you're after is there's proposals still from other groups that are working on this, I'm not as much, to try to put in 2014 on the ballot a constitutional commission, which would be a group that would look at Gallimore and figure out what you can potentially do on that, and then come back in 2016 and propose to the voters a comprehensive set of changes that would encompass all 3 of those and would say, because you're right, it's hard to pull one side of the string and not pull the other side out. And so, for instance, Gallagher is a really significant challenge right now. It's hard to fix school finance without going through Gallagher, and yet Gallagher is, is one of the most popular parts of the Constitution to regular voters. The idea of raising property taxes is not popular, and so you have to do that with the 23 and with the table altogether. And so I do think there is still, in some ways, this has been accused of being too ambitious and too long-term. I think in some ways I might scale it back to say our proposal is actually more of a tourniquet on a long-term improvement of a constitutional system that you would have to fix that would address some of the issues you're talking about. So I don't purport that this solves all of it. I do purport that it helps to stop the bleeding in some of the places where we're seeing it so dramatically as a way to help re-infuse investment to get us results in the time that we're waiting for a long-term constitutional fix.
Well, I do say that as you go around and talk more, if you keep using the word Gallimore and pay a small royalty, David and I promise to put all of those monies to our local district.
That would be great. People will look at me as if I have 2 heads.
Well, thank you. You've indulged.
No, thank you so much for all your work.
We'll send him the proper spelling.
That's right. I'm not sure I know that.
Maybe just one question.
Sure.
And first, thank you again for coming down. I know I had to be getting in your car at the Capitol and thinking, Douglas County, that's like Los Angeles, right? I mean, then the drive was actually about that, so I have some empathy for you. You've heard what folks had to say, particularly Kevin, particularly along the lines of equity. The formula has been set up now, so we have free and reduced lunch, English language learners. Obviously, those are formulas that don't benefit Douglas County. And what I'll tell you about Douglas County voters, they're generous. They know our residents know that they are net taxpayers for the rest of the state, and that's okay. I mean, we're one state, we're one country. Everybody appreciates that. But they also have a feeling that they would like, particularly when it comes to education dollars, you know how people feel about that and their children. They want to make sure that they're doing well for their own at first. This would seem to exacerbate that problem and make it very difficult for us to go to our voters and say, this is a good idea for us to support it. And I say that in the context, by the way, irrespective of what you may have read and or heard about the Douglas County Board of Education. This is a group that in Douglas County, perhaps the most conservative county in the nation, if possible, actually put a tax increase on the ballot and supported it. So you're talking to a board that has an open mind. It's difficult to have an open mind about the proposal, though, because it seems to drive more money, particularly when we start moving to a progressive income tax system, out of the county, away from our kids, into other counties for their kids. With that background, you've got Douglas County taxpayers here. What do I say? Give me my argument to go to them and say, this is a good idea. Because as I sit here right now, I can't do it. It's difficult for me, and I'm confident I speak for the rest of the board. It would be difficult for us to support it in its current structure or in its, or even in a mildly amended structure. So how do I sell it to these folks out here?
That's a good question. So I think there are a couple things. Now, I can't tell them to talk to you or to talk to them because I'm telling you what to tell to them, and so maybe I'll talk to them. I think there are a couple of reasons why it makes a significant impact. One is you're still looking at, in the proposed formula, even with the minor amendment, in the range of a $750 per student investment in every child in Douglas County. And that is a significant investment in helping get the kind of outcomes you want in the district that you support and believe is doing good work. And so that is, and the data we have suggests that, statewide, the average contribution per taxpayer would be around $250. State average of investment for what two parents would pay. Now we know that you're right, that taxpayers in this district probably earn more than the statewide average, so that's not probably net even, but it does mean that it's not as if there's a dramatic underfunding of the district compared to those outcomes. And I would also say that your businesses, your kids are going to grow up and work in businesses, run businesses in this state, and you are going to hire people, work with people, do business with people from all over this state, certainly from all over the metro area. I think it is in the state's dramatic interest to make sure that we have a well-educated workforce. And what we find right now is if you wanted to open a new business in Douglas County, or you wanted to expand one, and you were shopping county by county or state by state, you would go to 30 foreign countries and 20 other states before you'd open a new business in Colorado. If your outcome was, where can I find the best prepared workforce to help me drive great results? And so I think that is truly a statewide investment in the same way that transportation is. The most important resource we have in the state is our human capital, is our people. And right now we're doing a pretty subpar job of long-term investment in helping those young people be the kind of prepared leaders that will be able to lead businesses and lead commerce and lead science and industry and politics. And so I think the balance is, no county is an island, particularly in this state and this metro area, that's the case. And so it's also in our interest to make sure we both increase investment in all our districts, and that we make investments in the districts that we know need the most significant support to get results. And that looks like significantly rural districts where they're dealing with all sorts of diseconomies and lack of access to resources. And one thing I found, I talked to rural districts, is I talked to a rural CFO who said they are paying right now currently for broadband access in rural districts in Colorado. For the same amount of data, they are paying 25 times the rate that Jefferson County is paying. And so there are real diseconomies of scale that come from not being able to have 80,000 students in your buying power when you go to walk out to any sort of vendor. And so the state, for that reason, has recognized in the formula that there's a size factor. For the same reason, we recognize that there are additional challenges on helping a student master English language arts who doesn't have English, and helping a student get the proficiency who's coming into 9th grade 3 grade levels behind. Those are real challenges in a system where you have a uniform high bar for all kids. And our goal is to make sure that you get all kids there. I have 3 kids. For me, equity in those 3 kids means I don't spend the exact same number on all 3 of them. If one of them needs glasses, I buy that one kid glasses. That doesn't mean that I buy the other 2 kids glasses if they don't need them. Well, it means that I buy them what I think they need to be successful in a classroom. And so district superintendents do that all the time. You know, you have different schools that have different costs based on their demographics or their unique needs or the leadership of that school. I think as a state, we have the same vision, which is we know we got to make sure all kids get the resources they need. But there are certain places or certain districts are going to cost us more than we have now. I think that helps us be the most successful. So that's the same approach I brought to running my family, same approach I brought to running my school, and same approach I've tried to bring to my work at the state level. And that's why I think it's important to come down to conversations like this. I think it's as important to have this conversation in Douglas County as it is a conversation, because you got to be direct about what the idea is and what the pitch is.
Well, certainly thank you for that. While you were, I ran a couple numbers of just taking the current trend of Douglas County carrying about 9.5% of income tax-based answers. And this is if we just go to a new higher but flat rate of taxation. So I think the one I saw went from 4.63 to 5.35. The graduated ones start changing that. So if they graduate, given where our income is, we'll see that share. So this is conservative. So these top two lines, this is the original, and this is with the floor. But and this is the program funds that are in there, and I estimated I think there's another 100 million in the innovation fund, if I'm not correct. So roughly just under 950 million for that, and that would be about 89 million of new tax dollars Douglas County would need to give, and what they get under the original would be $27 million for it. Even if we now raise the floor and add to the cost and bring it, we're talking about 107 million in new taxes. 70, a much higher number of dollars in return, but 107 to get 77. And again, there's a certain amount of help that the degree of tilt what we got to wrestle with. And I think that's going to be a really hard question to deal with too.
I understand that. And I think that's the idea. I'll have to look at the new formula. I know currently I had the same conversation with my constituents in Denver, because Denver, I think, is currently the single largest net tax contributor under the current formula. And so I have to look at it. And so they had some concerns about that as well. And so it's, it is not untrue that you'll find that districts that have the highest percentage of commerce and business and income are larger tax contributors. That is a function of the state. And that's, that's true of a lot of our poor rural areas as well, is that they are not as significant tax contributors. And so you're right that that's the reality, and that's part of, I think, the debate about the flat tax versus the progressive is, do you try to balance out that fact by going to a flat tax opposed to progressive? I think that's a fair question.
One thing I would add is that it's so hard to qualify district by district because there's no district by district income tax breakdown. We've got, 60-some counties, 180-some odd districts, and they overlap, and it's here, there, and wherever. I would say that Denver as a whole.
Maybe that'll be in the transparency.
Yeah, one could hope, right? Yeah, maybe it'll be in the transparency. But the one difference, glaring difference between Denver's net contributing and ours is the mom and pop us. They have a lot of commercial property that offsets the individual investment as opposed to us. I've seen different figures thrown around. One is 10 cents on the dollar, one is 25 cents. I don't know
for residential versus commercial.
Right. How much? So for every mill dollar they put in, they're paid. They got about, and let's just call it a quarter because I've seen statistics both ways. Whereas we've got 99.9 cents. So
as residential?
Yes, residential. The individual taxpayer of the individual dollars per mill dollar raised shoulders a bigger burden of it here because it's just not the commercial property. And while that's the advantage of living in Denver, they, like you said, no communities on island themselves. So folks from here definitely go up there for dinner and ball games or whatever. It's that's part of the advantage of being Denver. So the contribution that they're putting back in services.
And that's because that goes back to Kevin's other point. That's why you've seen the business community in Denver cease to support any more 3A and 3B mill bonds, because I didn't know it was that high, 7%. We knew it's around 6 times the rate. And so as that gets more and more out of whack, what you're seeing is business saying, hey, we like kids like everybody else, but if we're paying 80% of the
I can see why then the Denver business community would go for I can see why the Denver Chamber would go for a state-centric
Well, they obviously, like everybody else, from like the Gallagher fix.
Right.
So I mean, I think that nothing changes their percentage contribution unless you change the Gallagher rates. And so they're going to be stuck at 29% while we're at 7.5%.
Gallagher is still around. I mean, not just in them, but with him.
He is, and he actually, I have not heard directly, but I've heard secondhand that he has publicly said he would support some changes. And so I think he loves it still being named after him, but I think he's realized there might be some
The ratios that are built in were even obsolete when they were in.
Yeah, it's really hard.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have a question on
Yes.
the return on investment and how we're going to measure these extra dollars that we're giving to these high-risk kids. You say we're going to measure it, but what accountability will there be when that's measured for those dollars? Are we going to measure outcomes? Are we going to tie outcomes to those dollars in the future? What accountability, what motivation is there to truly get those kids where they need to be?
Great question. So the answer is there will be outcomes tied to all of the new investment dollars and all of those new investment buckets. So yes, you'll look at what are the outcomes on the at-risk investment, what are the outcomes on the teaching and leadership investment, what are the outcomes on the innovation fund investment, on the special ed investments. You'll have all of those, and you'll probably have this in a new fund, so it's actually that much easier to audit. So you know exactly how much money came in and how much results you got out of that. And so, we obviously can't bind the future legislatures on what they do or don't do with the dollars. So we can't bind next year's legislature, let alone the 2020 legislature. But so what we will do is we'll put in place that transparency and the accountability and the report out of all those outcomes. So then the legislature can look at that and say, hey, you know what? This investment didn't pan out. We should stop doing it. And so that's as much as we can find that is force them to look squarely at the data and link that data exactly to the investment, and then they can be able to say, these three investments really panned out, these three really didn't. So that's the best kind of hand up from the grave after I'm long since terminated out. We can try to exercise.
And that's a leap of faith with term limits. By 2020, you'll turn over the legislature.
Yeah, I'll be turned out before this even takes effect. So, it seems to be consistent almost all the stuff like that.
Do we have any other DAC questions? So I'm going to have Ron open it up to questions from you all. So just raise your hand. He'll facilitate that part for us.
I think it's important to say how much we appreciate not only the expertise of Senator Johnston, but the time he has given and sensitivity to our questions. And once again, the Douglas County School Board and Douglas County School Accountability Committee, in an attempt to be as transparent and open as necessary for our community. This is another example. So if you would ask questions to seek clarity on this complex issue, I think it would be very important, because our community has to understand this, where the money is going, how much money we get. I mean, we know elections are based on the confidence in the schools. And so we're trying to do our part. Yes, sir.
Senator, the devil's in the details, so I need a couple details.
Yes, sir.
What area do you represent, sir?
I represent Denver.
Denver City, the entire city of Denver.
The east half, sir. I represent this east half.
Okay. You wrote this 200-page bill?
With a lot of help, but yes, I am the prime author.
Okay, so it's not something that, like Obamacare came from the SEIU,
No,
and you got to pass it to read it?
I've spent about 2 years working on it, so I'll take the blame for all of it.
All right. The next thing I heard from you was transparency. The last time I heard that from someone who stood on the same side of the aisle that you do, who is now the second elected time in Washington, D.C., slammed the door shut. In the past 2 weeks, the people that stood on the same side that you do, and I'll bet you include you, took away some of my Second Amendment rights. You mentioned the Constitution. You were concerned about that as far as the schools, but why weren't you concerned about that last week? And how much increase in what the state gets now, if your bill passes as you propose, how much increase is this going to give? And why do I have to redistribute wealth?
So let me try to answer all your questions. Would you like me to answer the Second Amendment question?
Yes, sir.
Let's keep it dedicated. In fairness, Senator Johnston's been great this time. We've asked him here to talk about his bill, and we've asked him, I think we've had a really good exchange of thoughts. let's, Second Amendment and all that stuff, and you and I probably agree, but look, we didn't ask Senator Johnston down here to talk about that, and let's keep it to education.
So your question is, I think I'll just address the redistribution question, which is the one you raised, right? Which is, I think you're asking how much would you pay and where would it go? I don't know, obviously, your income bracket, so I don't know what you would pay yet. And of course, as Kevin said, there are 40 proposals out there, potential title language, and so I don't know which one of those will be settled on. There are versions of progressive taxes that would pay you differently based on your income. There are versions of flat taxes. They all are income tax versions. The estimates that we've seen on the current number, if it's between 850 and 950 million, is about $250 per person per taxpayer. So that's about the net change in income that you would see for an average taxpayer. I don't know your tax bracket. That would be the average. And then the question of the redistribution, the bill is a long way from being over. So we don't know. If this floor amendment stays in, we will redistribute $300 million from the top 140 districts down to the 44 funded districts. That will cut every district's allocation by about $300 to fund those 40 lowest funded districts, which include Douglas County. So that will be a significant redistribution for those districts from then to the 4 funded districts. But we don't yet know what the net change will be. I would say what we do know is that Douglas County will see significant increases in per pupil funding, and so other districts, but they will change based on the formula. So there are 178 different outcomes based on how big your district is and what needs it has and what the demographics are, and so those will change. But it will just depend what this looks like and what the final analysis is. But I think that you will see, and Kevin's right, in the current tax code, there's some of that. I won't deny that. But we will know that what we're trying to do, especially with the floor funding amendment, is make sure that you limit any losses from those districts that are high contributing and are currently low funded.
So thanks for being here, Senator.
Last time I saw you, I was on the side of the road with no car and a broken computer.
And I'm a right-wing extremist, and I offered to give you a ride. I didn't say where I'd take you. But my question, the ROI is going to be measured on 4-year cycles. And what concerns me about that is pending voter approval, we're looking at annual tax increases, very significant ones. So how are we going to evaluate annual tax increases on a 4-year ROI? And that also applies to students. So freshmen entering in high school when this goes into effect won't benefit from an evaluation until after they graduate, so they're not going to benefit at all. That's also concerning. And then the last part of my question is the elephant in the room, PERA. I know that is a statewide issue, not specific to education, but it's had undoubtedly a significant impact on education. So how come that hasn't been addressed in this bill?
I'm glad you asked. And I do apologize for the hyper-technical nature of some of my answers, but there are folks like you who know this really well, and so I want to give you the most accurate answer. And for folks who don't know the intricacies of PERA, I'm happy to talk more after. So 2 questions. One is the balance of the return on investment is we want to make sure we have good data as frequently as possible. And we also want to make sure we don't spend more time and money collecting data than we do taking action on it. And so if you do a return on investment study every single year, it gets to be a little quite expensive. And the question is, how long does it take, as Dan knows on the educator side, how long does it take for us to show real results on a change? If you go to, if you go to a full day kindergarten or ECE program, if you go to an extended school year, I think you'll see some impact in year 1. You're probably going to see greater impact in year 2 or year 3. As a high school principal, I would say I wasn't a great one, I was a mediocre one, but you see much more as you get the team built, you get the program implemented, you get the students bought in, you start to see those changes year 2, year 3, year 4. And so I think we want to both be mindful about resources and be clear that we're actually getting a real picture of how well a program works. So that's why 4 years. Not went into that. If there's a big difference if you go 3 years, we could look at the cost in that, or 2 years, so I'm open to that. On the PERA question, so I also, I'm also the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, so I oversee PERA, I oversee finance directly. My wife likes to say I'm not the chair of our finance committee, but I am the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. So what we've seen on PERA is we just had a long presentation from PERA in January and a long conversation with the treasurer, Walker Stapleton. And what we've seen, are there any PERA retirees in the room? Any PERA? Okay. Okay, you're PERA. So in 2009, we made dramatic changes to PERA under Senate Bill 1. And we are currently being sued for that because we take some unprecedented steps that no other state has taken, including cutting benefits of current retirees. So we decreased the cost of living adjustments. We increased the contribution of employees. We increased the number of work years required under the rule of 92 for new employees who are coming in. So we made significant changes. Now, the folks who are worried about that, and that's meant increased cost to employees and increased cost to employers, so both. The people that are worried about PERA, most vocally the treasurer, have said the problem is that PERA, in order to make it solvent over time, its projections are at an 8% rate of return. And so at an 8% rate of return, PERA gets solvent, I think, in 20 or 23 years. And so all of the unfunded liabilities are covered based on new contributions and new work rules. And the concern has been, well, 8% rate of return is not reasonable. You should drop that to 7.5% or 7%. Now, for the school board members on the board, if we did that, dropping it to 7.5% would potentially increase your employer costs up to about 15%. So you would see huge hikes for district costs if we did that. And so before we do that, we ought to be pretty sure that we need to do that. And so what we've seen is in the last 4 years, since Senate Bill 1 was put in place on PERA, the 4-year return on that PERA fund in the last 4 years is 10.25%. So, and those haven't all